Hi, everyone. This is Roger Sadowsky. Today, I want to talk about what makes a Sadowsky bass special and not just another Fender copy that you see hanging on the wall of a music store. You know, you walk into a music store that has a good bass department. Most of the basses on the wall look like Fenders. You have Fenders and you have a lot of other basses that look like Fenders. So what makes a Sadowsky special? To answer that question, we really have to go back to the beginning and give you some history of what I do. When I started my workshop in New York City in 1979, most of my clients were the session players who did all the record dates, the jingle dates, the Broadway shows, all of that kind of stuff. I quickly discovered that it was a Fender world. The union directory for musicians in New York City, back in that day, had two chapters for bass, acoustic bass and Fender bass. You couldn't walk into a recording studio back in those days with anything but a jazz bass or a P bass. The jingle sessions tend to be short. They were about 45 minutes. And an engineer was not spending 10 minutes dialing in a bass he had never worked with before. So it was clearly a Fender world. And players were reluctant to go into a studio with anything but a jazz bass or a P bass. So most of my work in those days was taking their instruments and improving them the best I could. That meant retruing fingerboards, refretting them. Nobody knew back in those days how to shield the electronics so that they wouldn't have excessive hum or noise. People didn't know how to do noise-canceling work with pickups themselves. So most of my work was improving their basses, making them the best they could be. Sometimes that involved upgrading the hardware as well. And so I did this quite a lot for several years. The response to my work was very, very encouraging, and I kept on doing that. At the same time, at those years, I was starting to experiment with active tone circuits. Typically, a passive instrument has a volume and a tone control. I started experimenting with an active circuit, battery-powered, that would enable independent treble and bass tone controls. The first circuit I worked with had been made by a company out in California called Stars Guitars. I installed it in a client's bass, and he reported back to me he just couldn't believe how well his bass cut through the mix. He was mostly doing live work. I then had another young bassist come to the shop, and he had a 1977 jazz bass, and he's just said to me, "Make this the best bass you possibly can make it." So again, I retrued the fingerboard, I refretted it, I installed a badass bridge, I shielded the electronics, and I installed the preamp. That person happened to be Marcus Miller. And that was the beginning of my reputation as far as really being able to enhance a Fender and bring it up to a higher level. After Marcus, I installed the preamps for top players in New York like Will Lee and Neil Jason, on and on. And the feedback was just how perfectly the bass was able to sit in the mix. Back in those days, it was hard to tell whether you were hearing the bass or the kick drum. And the preamp, with its frequencies, just enabled the bass to sit perfectly in the mix and to be heard separate from the drum. So I knew I was onto something here that really, really worked. Stars Guitars soon went out of business, and then I switched to a similar circuit that was being made by Bartolini. And these circuits basically had two wide bands, a treble boost centered at 4K and a bass boost centered at 40 hertz. And as you boosted treble and bass, by default, you attenuating the lower mids at around 500. And I'm convinced to this day that it's that slight mid-range scoop that also really helps the bass sit so well in the mix. And some of the biggest compliments I get to this day are from recording engineers and front-of-house sound people just telling me they don't have to touch a thing on the board when a player has a Sadowsky bass. It just sits perfectly in the mix, and we like to borrow the expression from Steve Jobs at Apple that the bass is plug and play. And that's all that has to be done. Around 1990, I wanted to introduce my outboard preamp for people who didn't want to modify their basses. And at that time, I knew I needed a new supplier. So there was a guy down the hall from me. You'll probably recognize his name. His name is Alex Aguilar. And this was before Aguilar Amps became a company. I had Alex design my new preamp circuit with no intention of making any dramatic changes, but I was able to now have them manufactured by myself and solve the supplier issue. So a lot of what makes a Sadowsky bass special is the preamp. The other thing that I discovered back in those days is I would do these mods to all these Fenders. Some were spectacular when I was done, and some weren't that much better than when I started. And I had to look at, what's the difference? Why is this bass sounding so great and this bass sounds better but not amazing? Now, I started out in 1972 building acoustic guitars, and that training really came into play at this point in my life because I realized that the basses that were sounding the best were the ones that were lighter in weight, and the ones that were lighter in weight were the ones that sounded the best acoustically unplugged. And I used to advise people if they were going to a music store to buy a Fender, for example, to try 3 or 4 of that exact same model, and whichever one sounded the best acoustically, that was the one you should buy. And I still adhere to that theory. And as a result, I've always specialized over my entire career in building lightweight basses. And there was a time when I wasn't able to get wood as light as I wanted, and that's when I began my process of chambering the interior of the bass and then putting a top on every body, either of the same wood or a fancier top. And the chambering reduces about 3/4 pounds of weight, and it increases the acoustic resonance. So what we have here is over a 10-year period of developing a way to take the Fender standard, which Leo got a lot right the first time. I have to give the guy credit. And I've just raised the bar, both in terms of workmanship, quality of materials, weight control, and more sophisticated electronics. So that's a lot what makes a Sadowsky bass special and different from every other bass that you might see on the wall in a music store. So today, a lot of basses on the market do have active tone circuits. And what makes my Sadowsky preamp different from all the others? Most of the circuits on the market today are made with a component referred to as an op amp. And what this does is enables you to have a treble boost or cut, a bass boost or cut, and a mid-range boost or cut. I have always used a circuit that's based on transistors, and transistors in the solid-state world are about as close as you're going to get to tubes. They have a very natural, organic tone. And the limitations of a circuit built on transistors is you can't cut. You can only boost. So my preamp has always had a treble boost and a bass boost. It's also difficult to incorporate a mid-range because with this type of circuit, if you change the mids, it also changes the treble and bass. So it's always been a treble boost, a bass boost, centered at, again, 40 hertz on the bass, 4K on the treble. Now, in 2009, when I released the Will Lee model, prior to that, Will Lee had been asking me for more punch. I tried to address it with the wood choices. I tried to address it with pickup windings. Nothing I could do really satisfied what Will was hearing in his head. So I told him to get a parametric EQ, play with boosting the different frequency bands, and tell me what matched the sound that he had in his head. And he told me that what he was hearing was 500 hertz. Now, if we go back and talk about my bands of the preamp, so we have the bass band at 40 hertz, we have the treble band at 4K. They're wide bands, and where they don't meet is right around 400, 500 hertz. And it's that attenuated mid-range scoop, as I said before, that I really think helps my bass cut through the mix well. I decided to try some op-amp circuits to give Will what he wanted, and he kept saying, it doesn't sound like my bass. It doesn't sound like my bass. This one doesn't sound like my bass. And that's when I realized I had to keep my original transistor-based treble boost, bass boost circuit, and then piggyback a separate mid-range circuit on top of that. So it retains the traditional Sadowsky sound and then adds the ability to separately boost mids. So that was the genesis of the Will Lee preamp, and that is now exclusive to the Will Lee model and the single cutaway model. Another change I made back in the day was because my circuit can't cut, the treble at 0, which is flat, is the warmest and darkest the bass can sound. And there were a lot of players who wanted to get a warmer tone than that. So what I did was I incorporated an old school passive Fender type tone control into my array of knobs and controls, and I called it the VTC, which stands for Vintage Tone Control. And the Vintage Tone Control works in active mode or passive mode. It enables you to roll off a wide amount of high frequencies to get a warmer, rounder tone, and rolled all the way off, it could almost get close to a flat wound James Jamerson Motown type of sound. So now we have the versatility of the Sadowsky preamp, the VTC to get a warmer tone, and then on the Will Lee model, the addition of a mid boost. I like to think that my preamp has stood the test of time. Again, the compliments I get from recording engineers and front of house sound people is always the best feedback that I get, and nothing made my day better than to get an email from some of them just to tell me just how much they love working with the Sadowsky bass. And in fact, it's at the point like with the Broadway shows in New York, players are allowed to have substitutes, and they don't want the substitute to play a different bass. So the bass that the original bassist has stays at the show for the subs to use because they don't want anything else. That's a lot of the history of the preamp and what makes, again, a Sadowsky bass special. In conclusion, I think you understand now that a Sadowsky bass hanging on the wall or on the screen of an online store, it's not just another Fender copy. It's the result of my 53 years of making guitars, of working with top professional players, of being located in New York City, where I have constant communication and contact with working professional musicians. And I think you will be very pleased with the standard that I've established for my instruments. And I encourage you to try one when you have the opportunity. And I hope you'll become a member of the Sadowsky family sooner rather than later. Take care.